Alright, so finally finished up my motor test rig, and what started out as just a frame with a motor because I wanted to go through and check some of these motors that I picked up. This is one of the bikes from the 7-bike haul home that I did at the spring of this year, and it was a first gen. It's a 81 750, but I already got a couple of those, and I restored, working on several of them. I still got a 535 that's coming in, get to restore next, and there's 5 other bikes in the other garage. So I figured I didn't need another first gen, so I figured I would take this motor and turn it into a test rig so I could test some motors. But what started out as just a motor on a frame, just to check the motors out as I repair them or rebuild them, turned into kind of a big old morph of a test rig, because what I got to thinking about was this would be useful to check dual carbs versus things like the single carb intakes and things like that. And so I started adding. So what we ended up with is a pretty nice rig. The only thing that I can't test right now is the actual torque of the motor, but we're working on that. We're going to see if we can get a motor torque in there, but we got most everything else on there. So we can check oil pressure. We got oil pressure down here, and then up here this gauge is actually the exhaust gas temperature, so I can read the front and the back with these exhaust temp gauges right there. And I went ahead and added an air fuel mix ratio gauge on, and so I got O2 sensors plumbed in. So we got one for the front and one for the back right here. And so we can check our air fuel ratio. That's going to help us when we study these carbs to see if a single carb acts like a dual carb. So we got that set up, got a little voltmeter. I got vacuum gauges on the manifold. So for dual carbs, it's going to show the vacuum of both carbs. For a single carb setup, it'll show right as it comes into the cylinders. And of course we got our gauges up here so we can see our RPMs. And the clutch is all set up. Everything's all set up on here. So pretty slick little setup. The thing that I recently added that was the most complicated is this power steering pump off a BMW. And what that does is when I choke back with the valve up here, it increases the pressure on the power steering pump. And as you can see back here, this used to be a rear wheel. And what I did is I cut the inside of the wheel out, turned it down on my lathe, and made me a micro V driving hub right there. So that was pretty slick. Worked out good. And what it does is it powers the power steering pump. So when I choke the valve down, I can load the motor down to simulate load. That way I'm not just testing a motor freewheeling. I can actually put some load down on it. And that thing is a hoss. I've actually blowed out 2 gauges. You can see what happens when you spike a gauge. They no longer read 0 anymore, because this thing will put out well above 2,000 psi. And now I got a 4,000 psi gauge on it, and it could probably spike that, because when I choke the valve down, it'll actually stall this motor. So that thing can at least hold back, I don't know, 20 or 30 horsepower. I don't have it up, full rev or anything like that when I'm doing it, but I've choked it down a couple of times and actually stalled this motor. So interesting setup there, works quite well. And like I say, that pump puts out 200 bar is what its pressure load is. So that's pushing 3,000 psi before it hits its bypass. So definitely can choke a motor down. So we got all this set up, and I got to clean up my wiring and all that. But overall, we got us a nice little test rig right here. And I can also measure fuel, because I got a little gas tanky thing up here that's got graduations on the side. And so I can see how much fuel consumption I have at the different RPMs when I'm doing my testing. So without further ado, we'll fire this thing up, and you can see the gauges run, and you can see what a stock motor does for its air fuel mix when it's tuned pretty close. I don't have it exact, but running a little bit rich because I don't want to overheat my motor. But I got a big fan here, and so when I do some testing, I can turn my fan on and cool everything down just like it's running down the road, and we'll be able to check things. So we'll fire this thing up, and you can see what the gauges look like. Alright, so let's see what our motor test rig does in action. So we can turn him on. We got our fuel turned on, all of our gauges are on, and you can see the air-fuel ratio gauges are coming on, but I'll go ahead and start it. And we're able to read most everything off our motor. So we got oil pressure down here. We can see our motor's oil pressure. This one is reading the exhaust gas temps, and they're not going to be the same numbers, the top and the bottom, because they're in different positions on the exhaust. So I'm not too worried about that. I just need comparisons on what's going on with the temperature. And we got our vacuum, manifold vacuum here on the gauges. And now our air fuel is reading. And like I say, I'm running a little bit rich on idle because I got these pods on here. When I rev it up, you'll see those numbers come up. We got volts and we got RPM. So if I rev it up, you can see what happens. So we can check everything. Now, if we turn our pump on back here, we can load the motor down. So we just got to put it in gear over here. See our pump turning. So that's loading the motor down a little bit. So now when I rev it up, see my air fuel goes up a little bit higher, and my temperatures are getting a little bit higher because it's under load. So there we go. That's how our test rig's going to work. We'll shut it off. So we should be able to measure most everything, and we can set up and test these dual carbs versus things like my single carb intakes. And like right here, there'll be some videos out on the channel for this as well, now that I got my rig running. But I got an old one with unequal runners here, and then I also made me one because I was curious whether or not having unequal runners would make any difference to equal runners, so I made me one out of stainless here. So we're going to test both of these against the dual carbs, and then we're going to be able to measure all of these measurements off the motor with it under load, and we can see if there's any differences. Well, alrighty, stay tuned for the testing on the dual carb versus the single carb with my new little motor rig here. And thanks for watching.